Hey everyone, this is Matt Lemaster, and I am presenting my paper on Chapter 5 in Galatians and Christian Theology. The authors of this article are Carla Pullman and Mark Elliott. And I chose to do Chapter 4 because the topic of patristics was really interesting to me, and I thought it would be interesting to see how the other authors tied together different themes of connection in the book of Galatians. And so I'll go ahead and read it, and then I'll give a couple concluding thoughts about it and probably comment on the way. So this is how it begins. The early Christian intellectual tradition and the development of early Christian theology diverged from a central point: their discussion of Pauline letters in general and Galatians in particular. In their stimulating essay, Pullman and Elliott provide a sampling of 5 early commentators on Galatians. This essay will summarize and then proceed to interact with their findings. First, Pullman and Elliott survey Marius Victorinus. In Galatians, Victorinus finds philosophical, theological, and polemical fuel for advocating for Orthodox Trinitarianism during the persecution of the Arian Emperor Justin. Victorinus is marked for not interpreting Galatians with the Old Testament or other scriptures. That is to say that he read whatever passage he was commenting on, he just commented on that passage and didn't try to connect it with the rest of the canon. However, Victorinus interprets the epistle in a way recognizable to many Protestant interpreters, both in view to monergism and sola fide. I found the section on Victorinus very interesting because he was obviously in a time before Augustine even, and he articulated what today we might think of as a Calvinistic approach to soteriology, far before Augustine ever came, and so it was very interesting. He also seems like he is articulating a view which is in line with the modern Protestant Reformation. The second commentator, they do Ambrosiaster. So second, they survey Ambrosiaster. Ambrosiaster's commentary both contrasts and coheres with Victorinus. In contrast, Ambrosiaster interacted with much of the Old Testament and interprets Galatians with much more room for free will. Ambrosiaster also highlights the contrast between the law and the gospel. However, like Victorinus, Ambrosiaster advocates a strong doctrine of justification by faith alone, even articulating the imputation of Christ's righteousness. I thought Ambrosiaster was very different. He is writing with a different purpose, at least as Pullman and Elliott interpret him. He's not writing with the same philosophical approach that Victorinus did, and he's probably more of a churchman, and so he's trying to connect his work with much of the rest of the canon, and yet his work is also and so you see that he's connecting it with more scriptures in the Old Testament. He, in contrast to Victorinus, Ambrosiaster would have been more akin to what we think of as Wesleyan today. He wasn't a strict monergist. And yet there's a lot of similarities between Victorinus and Ambrosiaster, and specifically the doctrine of justification by faith alone. The third commentator they survey is Jerome. Jerome's commentary is akin to the modern exegetical commentary, a philological endeavor that is closely intertwined with Jerome's understanding of the rest of Scripture. In all this, we see Jerome's understanding that the text is prime above others. At times, he even contradicts his own words as he is attempting to articulate what Scripture clearly teaches. Jerome clearly was a giant in the early church, and so his commentary on Galatians was a lot denser and a lot more concerned with what today some disciplines that we would think of as text criticism, and he's very concerned to understand how Paul uses the Old Testament in Galatians. There are some comments in Jerome's commentary on Galatians which apparently contradict other places that he's written, and I think that is probably because Jerome is less concerned with building a system of theology and more concerned with clearly explaining what the text itself has to say. More on Jerome in a second. The fourth commentator they survey is Augustine. Augustine's commentary on Galatians is marked for his similarity to and likely reliance on Victorinus and likely Ambrosiaster. In contrast to Jerome, Augustine's commentary is more coherent with the rest of his body of work. Further, Augustine's commentary balances truth to the gospel on the one hand and a sensitivity to the emerging Catholic establishment. Finally, Augustine is remarkable for his development of the justification by faith. Augustine's commentary was interesting because it was intertwined with a lot of the rest of his own work, and it seems to stand in relationship to both Ambrosiaster and Victorinus's early work. It was really interesting to see the connections between the three. If you want to think of Jerome as the ancient equivalent of an exegetical commentary, Augustine's probably would have been the equivalent of more of a pastoral commentary, it would appear. The final survey Pullman and Eliot provide is an early Christian poem on Galatians. The authors connect this poetry to Augustine's City of God. The emphasis is on the continuity between the people of God in the Old Testament and the New, in contradistinction to Marcion. A very interesting poem. I'm not 100% sure that it belongs in this essay, but it was interesting to see the connection with Augustine and with some of the themes of Galatians. There are both strengths and weaknesses to this essay. This essay seems to be particularly oriented toward describing the apologetic value of the early commentators on Galatians. The authors try to show that the commentary tradition of Christianity was meant to build a robust defense against outside heretics. Yet, in this rigid search for intellectual hegemony, the authors take pains to describe connections between the various commentators of comparison and contrast. Thus, Pullman and Eliot paint a picture where the early Christian commentators paved the way for modern commentators as a united front against heretics, while an honesty to the text and a willingness to disagree with one another. As a result, the Christian commentary tradition has been influenced by agreement on the fundamentals of orthodoxy and yet vibrant debate. We see in these commentaries that they are more akin to having a center that they all agree on, whereas maybe they disagree on tertiary matters, as opposed to they're all on the exact same page when it comes to every other point. They all use the text in different ways. There are four weaknesses with this essay, though. First, this essay is that it is not clear enough on matters of essential agreement. For example, 3 of the 5 commentators have agreement on matters of justification and faith, yet this is never clearly articulated. It appears to be a coincidence on the author's part. However, little discussion of Jerome's theology of justification is given. Did Jerome agree with the other commentators? We do not know. As Busenitz, in his wonderful book, Long Before Luther, has helpfully shown, Jerome taught this elsewhere. Was his commentary on Galatians consistent? Another weakness is the commentator's reliance on the Latin Church alone. This easily could have been augmented with a commentator such as Chrysostom. Instead, they contain their findings to 4 Latin Church fathers. A third weakness of this is that its actual interaction with the original source is very limited. Instead, it mainly interacts with third-party sources. The quotes from the actual fathers are noticeably scant. The fourth weakness of this essay is that the inordinate amount of space dedicated to Jerome. Jerome occupies 8 full pages in their argumentation, while each of the others receive 2 to 3 pages. The result is a severely truncated argument. The fifth and final weakness of this essay is that it tries to bite off more than it can chew. It ought to have reduced the commentary tradition on a specific range of scripture, more specifically comparing a wider breadth of commentators. In conclusion, this was a helpful and stimulating article. In particular, it was valuable in showing the apologetic function of the early commentary tradition. However, there are many weaknesses to it, including the ambiguity of agreement, lack of diversity among sources, little interaction with original sources, and too broad a task for too narrow a space. It was great. It was really good. I really liked it. I highly commend a book that goes a lot farther than it, which is Nathan Busenitz's Long Before Luther, which was published with Moody Publishers last year. I think Busenitz excels where these two authors, while they write a pretty good essay, they don't go nearly as far as he does, and thus their work is not nearly as good. Thanks again so much. Bye.